June 23, 1986. Enos, Indiana. The sun had barely risen over the endless rows of corn, dew glinting on the stalks like shattered glass. A farmer trudged along a narrow dirt path, his boots sinking slightly into the wet earth. Something caught his eye, a patch of soil that looked recently disturbed, out of place among the uniformity of the field. Curiosity turned to horror as he knelt down, his hands brushing away the loose dirt. Beneath the surface, he found two bodies, pressed side by side. Blunt force trauma had left their faces unrecognizable, the remnants of a life defined by violence and loyalty, now reduced to mud and blood. Anthony, Tony the Ant, Spilotro and his brother Michael, Chicago's notorious enforcer and his sibling, had been beaten and buried alive. The discovery sent ripples of shock from this quiet Indiana farm all the way to the neon-lit streets of Las Vegas, and further north to Chicago's cold, concrete corridors of power. Tony Spilotro had once been untouchable, the Chicago outfit's man in the desert, enforcing mob control over casinos, skimming millions, and keeping the peace through fear and brutality. Yet now, the desert had claimed him, leaving only a shallow grave and a trail of questions that law enforcement could barely begin to answer. This was more than a crime scene. It was a signal. The empire Tony had helped build in Las Vegas, an empire of smoke-filled casinos, hidden ledgers, and silent threats, ended here, in a field where the wind whispered through the cornstalks. A life that had danced on the edge of power, control, and terror had been extinguished in the humblest of places, leaving behind a grim reminder: even the most feared men have their limits, and even the desert cannot protect its own. From the Midwest to the Strip, investigators knew one thing with certainty: the Chicago outfit had made a decision, and the consequences of that decision would echo for years, shaping the very soul of organized crime in Las Vegas. The bodies in the cornfield were not just the end of two lives, they were the final act in a story of ambition, betrayal, and the lethal calculus of mob justice. And for the millions who had thrived under Tony Spilotro's shadow, the world would never be the same. Las Vegas, late 1960s. The desert stretched endlessly, a sun-baked canvas of sand and sagebrush. On that barren landscape, neon signs began to pierce the horizon. Stardust, Fremont, Desert Inn, Tropicana. They promised fortune and escape. They hid a different reality beneath their glitter. The Chicago outfit had arrived. Midwest families, Chicago, Kansas City, Cleveland, Milwaukee, saw the city as a gold mine, a place where the law was slow and opportunities were fast. They were not here for tourists. They were here to control money, enforce loyalty, and ensure compliance through fear. Casinos became their vaults, the Strip their playground, and the shadows between slot machines their empire. At the center of this network was Frank "Lefty" Rosenthal, a man from Chicago with a mind for numbers and odds. He managed multiple casinos for the outfit: Stardust, Fremont, Marina, and Hacienda. His genius was subtle. He orchestrated skims, diverting millions of dollars before taxes or regulatory reports could capture them. Casinos appeared profitable to outsiders, but the true wealth flowed north to Chicago, siphoned quietly into the outfit's accounts. To protect this operation, the outfit sent Anthony, Tony the Ant, Spilotro. Born in Chicago in 1938, Tony had learned the rules of enforcement on the streets, in alleys, and in backrooms. He had built a reputation as a ruthless, reliable enforcer. His orders were simple: protect the money, enforce the rules, and eliminate threats. He moved to Las Vegas around 1971, carrying the authority of Chicago with him. Tony's methods were direct, effective, and violent. He recruited a small crew of men from Chicago, men who understood both loyalty and intimidation. This crew became known as the Hole-in-the-Wall Gang. Their name came from their method: breaking into properties by cutting through walls and bypassing locks, alarms, and security systems. Every theft added to their reputation, every bold strike a message. The Chicago outfit controlled this city, both in boardrooms and in alleyways. By the early 1970s, Tony had established a presence that combined street-level enforcement with corporate influence. He protected Rosenthal and other outfit-managed casinos while conducting independent criminal operations, burglary, theft, and intimidation, outside casino walls. He became a bridge between the organized, regulated world of casino management and the unregulated, brutal streets. The Strip thrived under this dual structure. Casinos reported record profits. The public saw lights, glamour, and jackpots. They did not see the thousands of dollars skimmed from vaults and pits before taxes. They did not see the violence behind the closed doors, the silent enforcements, the bodies that would eventually tell the story of power and greed. Tony's crew did not just steal, they enforced. They visited contractors, local businesses, and residents who resisted outfit interests. They applied pressure subtly and sometimes violently, leaving an unmistakable impression. Resistance was dangerous. Some victims survived. Some did not. The message, clear and silent, allowed the outfit to maintain control without attracting immediate law enforcement attention. Law enforcement began noticing patterns by the mid-1970s. Local police investigated burglaries and robberies that seemed too coordinated to be random. FBI agents traced connections to Chicago. Wiretaps and surveillance hinted at organized operations behind what appeared to be petty crime. Frank Cullotta, a member of the Hole-in-the-Wall gang, would later become a crucial informant, confirming the extent of Spilotro's operations and detailing his methods. While Tony enforced the outfit's rule, he also indulged in personal ambition. He relished the thrill of high-profile heists, the strategy behind burglaries, the power that came from controlling both street crime and casino security. This ambition drew attention, and it began to fray the carefully maintained invisibility that had protected the outfit. Each robbery, each bold act of violence, increased risk. Every high-profile theft was a potential link back to the Chicago bosses, a thread that law enforcement could pull. Tony's genius lay in balancing these two worlds. He understood casino operations, the flow of money, the timing of collections, the movement of high-stakes gamblers. He understood street enforcement, threats, intimidation, leverage, and fear. He combined these skills to create a network of influence that extended from the Strip to Chicago, connecting numbers, people, and power. Yet, the more visible Tony became, the more vulnerable he was. Other mobsters whispered about his recklessness. Supervisors in Chicago noted that Tony's actions risked exposure for the entire outfit. But he continued. His presence in Las Vegas was both protector and liability, a man capable of extraordinary control, yet prone to impulsive acts that drew attention. By 1975, the network was sophisticated. Skims were structured, money flowed north, and the casinos continued to grow. Yet, Tony's other ventures, robberies, intimidation, and the small-scale criminal operations of the Hole-in-the-Wall gang, began creating an operational footprint that was difficult to conceal. Each successful heist added notoriety and danger. The Chicago bosses watched, cautious and calculating, knowing that one misstep could unravel years of careful planning. The Strip, dazzling and chaotic, was now both playground and battlefield. Tony Spilotro, enforcer of the Chicago outfit, stood at the center. He commanded loyalty, inspired fear, and managed operations both violent and financial. Yet, within this empire of neon lights and quiet threats, the seeds of collapse were already sown. Each heist, each act of violence, and each bold decision would eventually draw the attention of law enforcement and the scrutiny of mob leadership. By the end of the decade, Las Vegas had become a symbol of both opportunity and danger. Casinos continued to thrive, tourists continued to flock, and the neon never dimmed. But beneath the glitter and spectacle, the Chicago outfit's power rested on one man's enforcement, one crew's daring, and the delicate balance between order and chaos. Tony Spilotro was the perfect enforcer for the perfect crime city. But the desert, like the city itself, was indifferent to ambition. Every step he took, every risk he accepted, brought him closer to a reckoning. Las Vegas was his kingdom, the casinos his treasury, and the streets his domain. Yet even kings have limits, and the empire he helped build would demand a price no enforcer could escape. By 1979, Anthony "Tony the Ant" Spilotro had established himself as the Chicago outfit's enforcer in Las Vegas. He had a reputation that extended beyond the Strip. fearless, ruthless, and unpredictable. To maintain control, he assembled a crew of trusted men from Chicago, some of whom had criminal histories stretching back to the Midwest streets. They called themselves the Hole-in-the-Wall Gang, a name derived from their signature method, breaking into properties by cutting through walls, ceilings, and floors rather than using doors. The first targets were jewelry stores. The gang selected locations based on security weaknesses, delivery schedules, and the predictability of owners. They struck in the dead of night using crowbars, saws, and sledgehammers. Each job was planned with military precision: surveillance, mapping entry points, timing shifts, and escape routes. Their skill was in speed and stealth, but violence was always a possibility and occasionally necessary to enforce compliance. Private homes and safe deposit companies soon became part of their operations. The crew adapted their methods. Some would pose as repairmen, others as utility workers, blending into the environment until the moment of attack. Their crimes were audacious, leaving few clues for investigators. Yet the more successful their hits, the more attention they drew. Local police began noticing patterns: locks bypassed in identical ways, tools left in similar configurations, and a trail that eventually led back to Chicago. Frank Rosenthal, the outfit's casino manager, watched these developments with unease. Rosenthal had built his career on discreet financial manipulation, skimming millions from casino vaults without drawing notice. He understood that Tony's street-level operations, robberies, burglaries, and home invasions, were attracting law enforcement attention that could threaten the entire Vegas operation. On more than one occasion, Rosenthal warned Tony, "You're bringing heat." Tony's response was a mixture of irritation and defiance. He believed control came from fear, and he underestimated how quickly the scrutiny would escalate. By 1980, the gang's list of heists had grown. A jewelry store on Sahara Avenue yielded tens of thousands in watches and gold. A safe deposit company downtown provided cash and bonds. In one high-profile burglary, Tony and his men stole from a private collector's home while the owner slept in the next room. Each act reinforced the gang's reputation: meticulous, bold, and uncatchable. Yet law enforcement's response was intensifying. The FBI, which had long monitored organized crime in Las Vegas, began focusing on the gang. Surveillance operations increased, wiretaps were installed, and informants were cultivated. Within the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department, a specialized task force formed, the Spilotro unit. Officers in this unit were assigned exclusively to investigate the crew, tracking patterns, compiling evidence, and attempting to anticipate the gang's next move. Their efforts included stakeouts, forensic analysis of break-ins, and interviews with victims. One of the first agents to take a lead role was Lieutenant Dennis Arnoldi, an experienced FBI investigator with a history of pursuing organized crime. Arnoldi recognized the gang's combination of street-level violence and strategic planning as a significant escalation. He coordinated with local police, sharing intelligence on suspects, methods, and connections to the Chicago outfit. Wiretap recordings began revealing conversations about planned hits, stolen merchandise, and disputes within the gang, providing the first concrete evidence linking Tony to multiple crimes. Despite growing law enforcement pressure, the gang continued their operations. In one instance, they targeted a Las Vegas jewelry chain, cutting through the roof and disabling alarm systems. They moved quickly, removing high-value items before the morning shift arrived. In another case, they hit a series of private homes, taking cash, jewelry, and firearms. Each successful heist expanded Tony's influence, attracting younger criminals eager to join a crew that seemed untouchable. However, the gang's boldness created friction within the outfit. The casinos relied on quiet, discreet skimming. Violence outside the Strip risked exposure and federal investigation. Tony's ego and paranoia often overrode caution. He distrusted new associates, suspected betrayal in every shadow, and preemptively punished imagined slights. This behavior intensified scrutiny. Agents noticed patterns. Men who had previously disappeared returned with unexplained wealth, while neighbors reported suspicious activity, leading to further investigation. Arrests began to occur. Associates of the gang were picked up for attempted burglaries, possession of stolen goods, and other criminal activities. Some cooperated with authorities, providing critical testimony about the gang's structure, Tony's leadership, and the Chicago outfit's connection to Las Vegas operations. Each arrest tightened the net around Tony, forcing him to adapt methods, rotate personnel, and relocate safe houses. Yet his core strategy remained unchanged: intimidation and audacity. Tony's paranoia also led to internal conflict. Members of the crew occasionally argued over shares of stolen goods, targets, and responsibilities. Disputes were handled quickly, often with violence, reinforcing Tony's dominance but increasing risk of exposure. Agents monitoring wiretaps and informants recorded these discussions, further corroborating evidence that would later prove critical in prosecutions. By 1981, the Spilotro unit had compiled an extensive dossier on the gang. Patterns emerged. The hole-in-the-wall gang targeted specific neighborhoods, used consistent methods, and maintained connections to Chicago's organized crime hierarchy. Lieutenant Arnoldi and his team correlated stolen goods with reported burglaries, and with the cooperation of informants, they were able to map the network of personnel, safe houses, and operational protocols. Tony's reputation, meanwhile, remained formidable. The public knew little of the violent undercurrent behind the glittering casinos, but in criminal circles, his name inspired fear and respect. He was a man capable of planning large-scale heists, while simultaneously enforcing the outfit's authority over Las Vegas. His crew's daring methods became legendary, both among criminals and law enforcement. Yet, the pressure was mounting. Wiretaps, surveillance, and informants had begun to unravel the gang's secrecy. Every move Tony made, every high-profile burglary, increased the likelihood of federal involvement. The Chicago bosses, previously confident in Tony's discretion, began to express concern over the attention he drew. The hole-in-the-wall gang had achieved notoriety, but their rise had exposed vulnerabilities. Law enforcement, now aware of their connections to organized crime, began preparing for coordinated actions. Arrests, indictments, and surveillance were imminent. The gang's successes had created a record of evidence that, if pursued carefully, could dismantle both Tony's operations and the outfit's Las Vegas influence. By the end of 1981, the balance of power was clear. Tony controlled the streets and the crew, but law enforcement was closing in. Every audacious robbery, every act of violence, had added to his legend, but also to the case files, the wiretap recordings, and the federal dossiers that would eventually bring the hole-in-the-wall gang into the national spotlight. Las Vegas, a city of lights and illusions, had become a battlefield. And at the center stood Tony Spilotro, enforcer, strategist, and increasingly, a man under siege. The streets were his domain, but the law was catching up, and every act of defiance brought him closer to the inevitable reckoning that awaited all men who operated in the shadows. July 4, 1981. Las Vegas. Fireworks illuminated the night sky, a cacophony of color and sound that masked the movements of men in the shadows. Inside Bertha's Gifts and Home Furnishings, a small retail shop on the outskirts of the Strip, Tony Spilotro's hole-in-the-wall gang prepared for a routine burglary. They had chosen the holiday for its expected chaos: fewer employees, distracted neighbors, and a city preoccupied with celebration. The plan was precise. The gang entered through a rear service entrance, cutting locks and bypassing alarms. They moved quickly, carrying bags for cash, jewelry, and valuables. Each member had a role: lookout, grab and run, and driver. Yet, despite careful preparation, the operation went wrong. A neighborhood patrol noticed suspicious movement. Lights were tripped. Alarms, previously disabled, began to sound. Panic spread through the crew. 2 gang members were arrested on the spot. Another attempted to flee, only to be caught in a narrow alley. The rest scattered but left behind critical evidence: fingerprints, discarded tools, and a trail leading to known associates of Tony Spilotro. Law enforcement had their first major break against the hole-in-the-wall gang. One of the arrested members agreed to cooperate, providing authorities with details of Tony's leadership, past burglaries, and connections to the Chicago outfit. The implications were immediate. The FBI, which had been monitoring organized crime in Las Vegas, recognized the opportunity. Wiretaps were already in place on Tony's associates, but this new informant confirmed the gang's methods and linked multiple crimes to Tony's oversight. Surveillance intensified. Agents listened to conversations about planned burglaries, casino skimming, and disputes within the crew. Each wiretap revealed a network that extended from the Strip to Chicago, connecting money, men, and authority. Meanwhile, Frank Rosenthal's position became precarious. As the man responsible for casino management and skimming operations, he had maintained an image of discretion. Yet the arrest of Tony's crew, combined with ongoing investigations, drew attention to the financial operations he controlled. Nevada regulators, acting on both press reports and law enforcement pressure, began reviewing Rosenthal's gaming license. In 1982, the Nevada Gaming Control Board revoked Rosenthal's license. The official reasoning cited concerns over criminal associations and potential influence by organized crime. The decision sent shockwaves through Las Vegas. Casinos that had flourished under his management faced scrutiny. Auditors combed through ledgers and investors grew wary. The empire Rosenthal had built, both legal and illicit, began to fracture under regulatory pressure. Rosenthal's personal life became a target as well. Later that year, a bomb detonated outside his home. Authorities concluded the act was likely retaliation for his public persona and press interviews, which had drawn unwanted attention to the Chicago outfit's operations. The explosion damaged property but caused no fatalities. Still, it sent a message. Las Vegas was no longer a safe playground, even for those who had long navigated its shadows with impunity. During this period, Tony's name surfaced in FBI Operation Strawman, a multi-state investigation targeting casino skimming operations. The operation focused on tracing illicit revenue streams from Las Vegas casinos back to organized crime families in the Midwest. Wiretaps, surveillance, and informants revealed that Tony was not simply enforcing rules or managing crews. He was directly involved in overseeing skimming activities, ensuring that millions of dollars bypassed official reporting and flowed north to Chicago. The bosses in Chicago began to view Tony differently. Once considered an asset, a man who protected and expanded the outfit's influence in Las Vegas, Tony was now increasingly seen as a liability. His audacious street-level operations, combined with the botched burglary and heightened law enforcement attention, threatened the entire network. The careful balance between profitable skimming and discreet control had been disrupted. Tony's ego and impulsive methods had created risks the outfit could no longer ignore. Law enforcement attention did not remain static. Lieutenant Dennis Arnoldi and his FBI team intensified surveillance of Tony and his associates. Informants corroborated previous wiretap recordings, providing context to conversations about cash movement, crew hierarchy, and the Chicago outfit's directives. Investigators began mapping the flow of money, linking specific burglaries, skims, and enforcement actions to Tony's direct oversight. Each piece of evidence strengthened federal and local cases against both the hole-in-the-wall gang and the larger Las Vegas network. By 1983, the once indomitable aura surrounding Tony and his crew began to crumble. Associates were arrested, informants continued to cooperate, and law enforcement began connecting the dots between street-level violence and high-level casino skimming. The hole-in-the-wall gang, once a symbol of audacity and skill, now represented a chain of vulnerabilities. Every robbery, every act of intimidation, every bold move had left traces that investigators could follow. Meanwhile, Rosenthal's absence from casino operations created instability. Managers who had relied on his guidance were unsure how to handle skimming, staff oversight, and compliance reporting. Without Tony's enforcement as a buffer, rival criminal elements attempted to encroach, leading to tension on the Strip. The illusion of control began to fracture. Vegas, the city built on deception and spectacle, began showing cracks in its foundation. Despite these pressures, Tony maintained influence over his crew. He continued to direct operations, recruit associates, and assert dominance in Las Vegas neighborhoods. But his autonomy was increasingly limited. Law enforcement attention, combined with Chicago's growing concern, placed him in a precarious position. He was a man caught between ambition and consequence, between loyalty to the outfit and survival under federal scrutiny. By the end of 1983, The Las Vegas empire that Tony and Rosenthal had helped build was under siege. Arrests, wiretaps, regulatory actions, and internal conflicts converged to create a perfect storm. The city's lights and glamour masked a network of criminal operations. But beneath the surface, law enforcement had begun dismantling the mechanisms that had once seemed untouchable. The cracks were no longer small fissures. They were structural. The hole-in-the-wall gang was exposed, Rosenthal was sidelined, and Tony's reputation as the untouchable enforcer began to tarnish. The desert, which had once offered opportunity and concealment, now reflected the inevitable consequences of miscalculation, audacity, and public exposure. Las Vegas in 1983 was a city at the intersection of law and lawlessness. Tony Spilotro remained a formidable figure, but the evidence against him mounted. The empire he had helped construct, the casinos, the crews, the skims, was beginning to unravel. And for the first time, the Chicago bosses had to ask whether their enforcer was a liability too dangerous to retain. The stage was set. The next moves, both by Tony and law enforcement, would determine the fate of the outfit's Las Vegas operations. The balance of power had shifted, and the consequences of past actions were about to collide with the relentless scrutiny of federal and state authorities. By 1984, the Desert Inn and Stardust were no longer the only lights drawing attention in Las Vegas. Anthony "Tony the Ant" Spilotro's operations had become a focal point for federal authorities. His crew's brazen burglaries, the skimming of casino profits, and the trail of violence in the city had left traces too obvious to ignore. Investigators had begun piecing together a network that stretched from the Strip back to Chicago, connecting stolen property, cash flows, and outfit directives. One of the most consequential developments came from within Tony's own ranks. Frank Cullotta, a former member of the hole-in-the-wall gang, began cooperating with the FBI. Cullotta had first-hand knowledge of the gang's methods: the late-night burglaries, the safe cracking, the beatings used to enforce obedience. He also knew Tony's connections to the Chicago outfit, including the direct chain of command and the methods used to funnel money north. Cullotta's testimony provided federal agents with critical insight into operations that had previously been shadowed in secrecy. Cullotta's cooperation was dangerous. Testifying against a man like Tony, who had enforced his authority with intimidation and violence, carried the risk of retaliation. Nevertheless, he began providing detailed accounts of past robberies, including locations, amounts stolen, and the involvement of specific associates. Wiretap recordings corroborated his statements, creating a growing body of evidence that directly implicated Tony in crimes both in Las Vegas and Chicago. As the FBI compiled dossiers, both Tony and his brother Michael Spilotro appeared on federal indictment lists. The indictments were comprehensive, covering burglary, conspiracy, and violations related to organized crime. For law enforcement, this marked a turning point. The Spilotro brothers were no longer untouchable enforcers in the shadows. They were now officially targets of federal action. Meanwhile, the Chicago outfit was experiencing its own upheaval. Joseph Iupa and John Cerrone, two top bosses, were convicted in the Kansas City skimming cases and sentenced to prison in 1986. Their removal created a power vacuum within the outfit, leaving a smaller group of leaders to manage operations and enforce discipline. Among the remaining leadership were Joey the Clown Lombardo and James Marcello, both experienced enforcers and strategists. They understood that the survival of the outfit depended on careful management of risk. Tony's high-profile activities, unpredictable temperament, and growing notoriety presented a problem they could no longer ignore. Tony's reputation for violence had always been an asset in the eyes of the outfit. Fear and intimidation were the tools that kept crews compliant and casinos under control. Yet by the mid-1980s, those same traits became liabilities. Reports from informants and wiretaps painted Tony as volatile, impulsive, and increasingly ambitious. Rumors circulated that he had ambitions to control the Vegas territory entirely for himself. Others suggested he might challenge Chicago's leadership directly. Whether true or exaggerated, these whispers were enough to alarm the remaining bosses. The bosses convened discreetly. They discussed risk, reputation, and the impact of federal scrutiny. Tony's actions had drawn law enforcement into a sphere that once operated with relative invisibility. Each burglary, each violent encounter, each news story connecting the hole-in-the-wall gang to the outfit increased pressure. The FBI's growing presence on the Strip meant that any misstep could jeopardize the outfit's broader operations, including skimming schemes that funneled millions of dollars to Chicago. In Las Vegas, Tony remained defiant. He continued to oversee crews, manage territory, and enforce obedience through fear. His presence loomed over the Strip's criminal underworld. Associates knew better than to cross him, yet the tension of federal indictments and internal outfit warnings created friction. Loyalty became conditional. Fear alone could not guarantee obedience when federal agents were listening and informants were speaking. The federal government's attention intensified. FBI agents monitored known associates, tracked bank accounts, and coordinated with local police. Surveillance photographs captured Tony moving between casinos, private residences, and safe houses. Wiretaps intercepted conversations about crew assignments, money transfers, and potential retaliatory actions. Investigators noted Tony's paranoia. He frequently changed locations, avoided predictable routines, and expressed suspicion of both allies and enemies. Each precautionary measure confirmed his awareness of growing threats, but also highlighted his increasing isolation. The indictment lists, combined with the cooperation of informants like Cullotta, placed Tony in a precarious position. Law enforcement now had the authority to arrest him, freeze assets, and subpoena associates. The veil of impunity that had allowed him to operate for years was gone. Chicago bosses, acutely aware of the risks, began evaluating their options. Tony's loyalty, once unquestioned, was now weighed against the potential danger his unchecked ambition posed to the outfit. By 1985, the calculus was clear. Tony had become a liability. His actions had attracted federal attention that could expose not only Las Vegas operations, but also Chicago's deeper criminal infrastructure. The risk of public scandal, long-term convictions, and financial losses was too great to tolerate. The remaining leadership concluded that decisive action was necessary. Tony's removal, either through containment or termination, became the only viable strategy to protect the outfit's broader interests. Rumors within the criminal underworld suggested Tony was aware of these discussions. He grew more paranoid, more aggressive, and more isolated. He pushed crews to commit higher-risk burglaries, monitored associates for potential betrayal, and flaunted connections that he once used to command respect. Each display of power and defiance only reinforced the leadership's conclusion. Tony's survival threatened the survival of the entire organization. By 1986, the stage was set. The federal indictments, combined with internal outfit decisions, left Tony marked. The hole-in-the-wall gang, once a symbol of audacity and skill, now operated under scrutiny, fear, and impending consequence. Associates began to distance themselves. Informants were cultivated, and the FBI prepared for coordinated action. In Chicago, Lombardo and Marcello coordinated the outfit's response. They considered Tony's influence, his potential alliances, and the risks he posed to the outfit's revenue streams. Tony's ambition, perceived or real, meant that his elimination was not only strategic but necessary. The decision was made quietly, deliberately, and with the approval of remaining bosses who understood that the survival of the organization outweighed loyalty to any single enforcer. Las Vegas had been Tony's domain, a city he controlled with fear, skill, and violence. Yet by 1986, it became clear that control was fleeting. Federal indictments, cooperating witnesses, and Chicago's leadership decisions converged to place Tony in the crosshairs. He was no longer the untouchable enforcer of legend. He was a marked man. The desert, which had offered opportunity and concealment, now reflected inevitability. The laws of loyalty and ambition, of fear and consequence, dictated that even the most feared enforcer could fall. Tony Spilotro's fate, intertwined with both federal investigation and the internal logic of the outfit, was sealed. The empire he had built was cracking, and the very power he wielded would soon catalyze his downfall. June 14, 1986. Bensenville, Illinois. Tony and Michael Spilotro received a summons from Chicago outfit leadership. ostensibly for a meeting to discuss their ongoing Vegas operations and potential reinstatement into the family's inner circle. Both brothers arrived expecting negotiation, perhaps diplomacy, or at least an opportunity to repair strained ties. The setting was ordinary on the surface. A suburban garage, neutral and unremarkable, masked the gravity of what awaited. Inside, the atmosphere was tense and calculated. Sources indicate that Tony and Michael were confronted immediately by enforcers loyal to the outfit's Chicago hierarchy. There were no guns fired. There was no shouting or immediate chaos. Instead, the violence was methodical and brutal, carried out with fists, blunt objects, and sheer physical domination. The brothers were restrained, hands and feet bound. Accounts vary on precise details, but consistent reports describe severe beatings. Bruises, lacerations, and broken bones marked their bodies. The attackers struck with intent, a clear message to the organization. Tony's disregard for orders and reckless ambitions had made him a liability. Michael, ever loyal to his older brother, endured the same brutality. Both men were rendered incapacitated before being removed from the garage. The execution of the hit reflected the outfit's strategic priorities. The Chicago bosses, Joey the Clown Lombardo, James Marcello, and others, needed to eliminate a threat without public spectacle. Tony's reputation in Las Vegas as a violent enforcer and a skilled manipulator had made him both an asset and a risk. His rumored ambitions to control the Vegas territory independently, combined with increasing federal scrutiny, made his continued survival untenable in the eyes of Chicago leadership. Once the beating concluded, the brothers were transported to a secondary location. Most evidence and law enforcement testimony later placed this site in rural Indiana, though the exact route and holding points remain partially reconstructed through informant accounts. Shallow graves were dug, and Tony and Michael were deposited into the earth. The act was silent, executed without witnesses, and intended to erase the threat completely. This event was both a culmination and a turning point. The suburban calm of Bensonville contrasted starkly with the violence occurring behind closed doors. No gunfire, no sirens, no immediate public alarm, yet the message was unmistakable. Even the most feared operatives could be neutralized if deemed a liability by the outfit. Tony's name, once synonymous with power and intimidation in Las Vegas, would soon appear in federal investigations not as a leader, but as a victim of internal enforcement. Within Chicago and Las Vegas, reactions were immediate but controlled. Associates who had previously benefited from Tony's protection and influence began reconsidering their positions. Fear replaced loyalty for many. Casinos that had relied on Tony's muscle and oversight remained operational, but the void left by his removal created instability. Some factions in Las Vegas began to defect, cooperate with law enforcement, or distance themselves from the outfit entirely. Federal authorities already monitoring Tony and his crew found the disappearance troubling. 9 days would pass before the full extent of the crime was revealed. The timing between the hit and the discovery of the bodies would later underscore the methodical planning behind the murder and the calculated attempt to remove evidence. The Chicago boss's decision to eliminate Tony and Michael reflected a broader organizational strategy. Removing a high-profile operative minimized risk of FBI exposure, curtailed internal power struggles, and served as a warning to others who might consider defying orders. The execution was personal, deliberate, and controlled, an enforcement method designed to maintain order within a criminal enterprise while reducing public attention. By the end of this operation, Tony and Michael Spilotro had vanished from the public eye. Their absence was soon confirmed by investigation, forensic evidence, and witness testimony in subsequent years. This calculated removal set the stage for federal discovery, the eventual unearthing of the brothers' bodies, and the dismantling of the outfit's Vegas skimming operations. The hit also marked a pivotal transition. Tony's aggressive control of Las Vegas had ended, leaving the city exposed to federal scrutiny and corporate consolidation. Frank Rosenthal, aware of the growing danger, relocated first to California, then to Florida, operating in the shadows and avoiding the public eye. The mob's influence over the Strip remained, but the structures Tony had personally enforced were weakening. In retrospect, the June 14th ambush was not just a violent act against two men. It was a strategic maneuver, a prelude to the federal dismantling of organized crime's grip on Las Vegas. It directly led to the discovery of their bodies in Enos, Indiana, on June 23, 1986. The chronology is clear: ambush, removal, burial, discovery, a sequence that would unravel the empire Tony had helped maintain for over a decade. The Spilotro's fate became a cautionary tale within the underworld. Their ambition, visibility, and refusal to fully adhere to Chicago leadership's expectations illustrated the risks of autonomy within a hierarchical criminal organization. The hit was decisive, leaving no opportunity for retaliation. It also foreshadowed the broader collapse of mob-controlled skimming in Las Vegas, signaling that even the most violent enforcers were ultimately expendable in the eyes of their superiors. June 23, 1986. A late morning sun illuminated the quiet cornfields of Enos, Indiana. The stalks swayed gently in a summer breeze, masking a secret buried beneath. A local farmer tending his fields noticed an area of freshly disturbed soil. The earth was uneven, slightly darker than the surrounding ground, and the signs were subtle but unmistakable. Curious and concerned, he called law enforcement. When the FBI and local police arrived, the discovery quickly escalated into a federal investigation. Officers dug into the soil and unearthed two decomposing bodies. Both were bound, their hands and feet tied with frayed ropes. The victims' faces were bruised, battered, and nearly unrecognizable. Clothing remained in tatters, marked by dirt and signs of prolonged struggle. Identification confirmed the worst fears of law enforcement. The bodies belonged to Anthony, Tony the Ant, Spilotro, and his younger brother, Michael. Autopsy reports were completed within days. Both men had suffered extensive blunt force trauma, consistent with severe beatings. Fractures lined their ribs and skulls, and contusions marred their torsos and limbs. There were no gunshot wounds. The killings were not impulsive acts of rage with firearms. Instead, they reflected controlled, premeditated violence, executed to ensure compliance, instill fear, and maintain the outfit's internal discipline. Investigators concluded that the brothers had likely been incapacitated for hours before burial, and possibly alive at the time they were placed in the shallow graves. The discovery sent shockwaves across multiple jurisdictions. In Chicago, the outfit quietly acknowledged the elimination of Tony and Michael Spilotro. Within the underworld, the news traveled swiftly. The man who had terrorized Las Vegas with a combination of charm, brutality, and paranoia was gone. Silence reigned among the remaining operatives. Ambition had limits. Loyalty had boundaries. Defiance carried consequences that even the most feared enforcer could not evade. Across the country in Las Vegas, the impact was immediate. Casinos, hotels, and nightclubs previously under Tony's oversight began experiencing turbulence. Frank Rosenthal, the man who had managed the skimmed earnings and navigated the casino's legal and operational complexities, felt the chill of uncertainty. He left Las Vegas shortly after the discovery, relocating first to California and later to Florida. Rosenthal lived under a cloud of suspicion and paranoia, constantly aware that the outfit's reach extended beyond the desert. He avoided public appearances, shifted residences frequently, and limited contact with old associates. The shadow of Tony's death, combined with law enforcement attention, made safety and anonymity his highest priority. Federal investigations accelerated. The FBI had long suspected widespread skimming and organized crime infiltration in Las Vegas, but the Spilotro's murders crystallized the urgency of the situation. Wiretaps, informants, and financial audits began exposing the full scope of the outfit's operations. Evidence revealed that Tony had controlled not only physical intimidation and enforcement, but also the oversight of illicit cash flows. He had funneled tens of millions of dollars through casinos, diverted profits, and maintained secret ledgers. With him gone, the control network fragmented. Associates, fearful for their own lives, began cooperating with federal authorities. Through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, prosecutions dismantled the outfit's skimming networks piece by piece. High-profile trials brought former enforcers, accountants, and casino managers to court. Testimonies detailed methods for diverting funds, laundering money, and maintaining secrecy across multiple jurisdictions. Wiretap transcripts captured conversations about hidden accounts, offshore transfers, and the management of skim pools used to enrich the mob while evading regulatory oversight. Each conviction chipped away at the empire Tony had once helped enforce, leaving the organization weakened and exposed. In Las Vegas, the city itself began a transformation. The casinos that once fed the mob's coffers gradually transitioned to corporate ownership. Mirage Resorts acquired multiple properties, bringing institutional investors, strict financial oversight, and regulatory compliance to previously opaque operations. Caesars Entertainment expanded under similar principles, emphasizing transparency and lawful governance. The era of skimmed Vegas was over, replaced by boardrooms, accountants, and publicly traded corporations. The skyline remained, but the architecture of control had shifted from mob enforcers to corporate executives. The contrast between the cornfields of Enos and the neon-lit Strip was stark. One location held the remains of a violent enforcement culture, while the other moved toward legitimacy and structure. Tony and Michael's deaths symbolized the end of an era, the violent, personal, and uncontrolled domination of organized crime in the desert. The loss of these figures was not only tactical but symbolic, signaling to remaining operatives that law enforcement and federal prosecution could dismantle what had once seemed untouchable. Psychologically, the murders left an indelible mark on remaining mob figures. Associates in both Chicago and Las Vegas internalized the lesson. Even high-ranking, feared, and flamboyant operatives could be eliminated when deemed necessary by leadership. Ambition, without careful calculation, could be fatal. Violence was an accepted tool, but unpredictability and ego were liabilities. Tony's reputation, once a combination of terror and respect, became a cautionary tale, studied by both criminals and investigators alike. Law enforcement leveraged the case to pursue additional targets. Beyond convictions for skimming and financial crimes, the FBI focused on unraveling chains of command and identifying vulnerabilities in the outfit's operations. Tony's removal had exposed structural weaknesses, decentralized cash flows, over-reliance on individual enforcers, and fear-driven compliance. Informants cited the Spilotro's fate as motivation to cooperate, providing crucial evidence against mid-level and high-ranking operatives. For Las Vegas residents and tourists, life continued. Casinos operated, shows went on, and the Strip glimmered as a beacon of entertainment. Yet beneath the surface, the city had changed. The omnipresent influence of Tony Spilotro and his enforcers had ended. Regulation, corporate oversight, and law enforcement vigilance became the new constants. The thrill of the neon skyline now coexisted with accountability, financial transparency, and the memory of the violence that had once dominated the city. Ultimately, the cornfield graves of Enos, Indiana, became a turning point. They were more than a final resting place for two men. They were a symbol of the end of a criminal epoch in Las Vegas. The Spilotro's deaths catalyzed law enforcement initiatives, reshaped the city's financial and operational structures, and demonstrated the limitations of personal terror in the face of systematic investigation. By the time the dust settled, Tony and Michael Spilotro were gone, but the lessons of their rise and fall remained. The Las Vegas of organized crime, where skimmed millions flowed through casinos unchecked, was replaced by a corporate, regulated, and transparent environment. The Chicago outfit endured, but the empire in the desert had collapsed. Federal prosecutions, corporate acquisitions, and legal reforms had closed the chapter on the era Tony had helped shape, leaving behind neon lights, empty graves, and a story of ambition, violence, and the relentless reach of justice. June 23, 1986, marked more than the discovery of two bodies in a cornfield outside Enos, Indiana. It marked the collapse of a direct, violent hand that had controlled Las Vegas for decades. Anthony, Tony the Ant Spilotro, the enforcer who had maintained the Chicago outfit's desert empire, was dead. Beside him lay his brother Michael, both victims of a brutal, premeditated execution ordered by the outfit. The violence that had once flowed freely through casino back offices, Hotel hallways and neon-lit streets had reached a turning point. The discovery of the Spilotro's bodies immediately sent ripples through law enforcement agencies across the country. FBI agents who had long monitored the Chicago outfit's operations saw confirmation that the outfit was willing to eliminate even its most powerful enforcers to maintain control. Las Vegas, once a city where mob influence was both omnipresent and subtle, had now lost its most notorious instrument of fear. Surveillance operations intensified, as investigators realized that the removal of Tony created both a vacuum and an opportunity. Associates and witnesses, once silenced by intimidation, began to cooperate. Wiretaps, financial audits, and undercover informants revealed the mechanisms by which the outfit had skimmed millions from casinos. Frank Rosenthal, the man who had managed the financial side of the outfit's operations, recognized the danger immediately. He abandoned Las Vegas shortly after the bodies were discovered, relocating to California and later Florida. Rosenthal maintained a low profile, but his movements were closely monitored by federal authorities. The empire he helped sustain in partnership with Tony Spilotro could not survive without its enforcer. The sophisticated skimming operations, the diversion of cash, and the intimidation networks began to unravel in the absence of the men who had enforced both obedience and fear. The city of Las Vegas, meanwhile, began a transformation that would forever change its identity. The casinos that had once funneled money into the outfit's pockets were gradually bought or merged into corporate holdings. Mirage Resorts acquired multiple properties, bringing professional management, financial transparency, and regulatory compliance to spaces once dominated by mob-led chaos. Caesars Entertainment expanded its footprint similarly, emphasizing legal oversight and corporate governance. The neon skyline remained, but the foundation of operations shifted from secret ledgers and enforcers' threats to accountants, auditors, and executives bound by law and public scrutiny. Federal prosecutions intensified. Throughout the late 1980s and into the 1990s, trials dismantled the outfit's skimming networks piece by piece. Testimonies from former associates detailed methods of diverting cash, laundering funds, and maintaining secrecy across multiple jurisdictions. Informants described skim pools, the hidden accounts where casino profits were siphoned before reporting, and wiretap transcripts revealed conversations about hidden bank transfers, offshore accounts, and money movement strategies. Each conviction chipped away at the organization that Tony had maintained through violence, intimidation, and sheer presence. Law enforcement's efforts extended beyond legal prosecution. The Spilotros' deaths became an operational lesson. Agents studied the structure of the outfit, identifying vulnerabilities exposed by internal conflict. The combination of internal fear, violent discipline, and ambitious overreach had created cracks in a system that once seemed impenetrable. Associates who had once feared retaliation were now willing to testify. The murder of Tony and Michael became both a catalyst for cooperation and a warning to remaining operatives. No individual, regardless of power or loyalty, was untouchable when the organization deemed it necessary. Psychologically, the mob itself absorbed the lesson. Tony's reputation, which had once blended terror with respect, became a cautionary tale. His ambitions in Las Vegas, his flamboyant enforcement, and his disregard for the subtle rules of organized crime revealed the cost of visibility. The outfit's leadership, including figures like Joey the Clown Lombardo and James Marcello, recognized that unchecked ambition among subordinates could threaten the stability of the enterprise. The elimination of Tony was not just revenge or punishment, it was a strategic reset, designed to protect the greater operation. For Las Vegas residents and visitors, life appeared unchanged. Shows continued, hotels expanded, and gambling floors operated at capacity. The city thrived, the neon lights burning brighter than ever. Yet the difference was structural. Where once enforcers and silent threats shaped the flow of money, now corporate compliance officers, accountants, and auditors dictated the rules. The Vegas Strip had evolved, its energy and glamour maintained, but the underlying mechanisms of control had shifted. The violence that had been an implicit tool of management was replaced by regulation, law, and oversight. The legacy of the mob remained, however, in more subtle forms. Stories of Tony Spilotro and Frank Rosenthal, of skimmed millions and secret ledgers, permeated local lore. They became part of the mythology of the city, reminders that the glittering entertainment capital had once been built on fear, extortion, and violence. Casinos stood taller and richer than ever, but the foundations were written in blood, sweat, and the audacity of men willing to break both law and morality for power. By the end of the 1980s, Las Vegas had fully entered a corporate era. The era of the hole-in-the-wall gang, of brutal enforcers, and of secret skim operations was over. The city's transformation demonstrated that organized crime could be dismantled not only through prosecution, but also through structural change and economic oversight. The neon skyline remained, but the culture of fear that Tony Spilotro had embodied had been replaced by institutional stability. Today, the story of Tony and Michael Spilotro serves as a warning and a historical record. It illustrates the fragility of power built on violence, the inevitability of law enforcement scrutiny, and the ultimate supremacy of structured oversight. Las Vegas may continue to glitter, casinos may continue to flourish, but the blood of the Spilotros lies beneath the surface, a reminder of the cost of ambition and the consequences of defiance within the criminal hierarchy. The mob's direct influence in Las Vegas ended with Tony's death, but the lessons of the era remain vivid. The city learned, law enforcement learned, and the world learned that even the most powerful enforcers are not immortal. Skimmed fortunes, secret ledgers, and intimidation networks could be dismantled when key figures fell, revealing the vulnerabilities inherent in all empires built on fear. Tony Spilotro's rise and fall, culminating in the discovery of the cornfield graves, symbolized the end of the outfit's Vegas. The empire he enforced crumbled not through a single act of law enforcement, but through the combination of strategic killings, informant cooperation, federal prosecutions, and corporate restructuring. The glittering lights of Las Vegas endured, but they illuminated a city that had left the mob era behind. In the end, the Spilotros' deaths were both a conclusion and a catalyst. They ended the age of violent personal control over Las Vegas casinos and triggered the dismantling of skimming networks that had enriched organized crime for decades. Their story serves as a reminder that empires built on intimidation and secrecy, no matter how successful or feared, are vulnerable to exposure, strategy, and the inexorable reach of justice.